Joining me now is Dr. Miles Pattenden. He's a historian of the Catholic Church at Oxford University and the author of Electing the Pope in Early Modern Italy. Okay, Miles, so in the Catholic Church, the Pope hasn't always been elected via a conclave. So how recently did the process of a conclave come to be?
Hello, Victoria. Thank you very much for having me on your network. The process of the conclave has emerged sort of over time. There wasn't one single moment, but there are perhaps three that are very important, all from the Middle Ages. First, in 1059, when Pope Nicholas II decided to restrict participation in the selection of his successor just to the clergy of Rome, that group we now call the cardinals. Second, in 1179, so about 120 years later, Pope Alexander III set out the basic rules which still pertain today. That's to say, every cardinal has a vote, and someone needs 2/3 of those votes to be elected Pope. And finally, there's the Bull Urbi Periculum by Gregory X in 1274, which set out the organizational rules of the conclave, specifically that the cardinals need to be locked up together in one space with a key, hence conclave in Italian, or conclave. And he also set out all kinds of other rules to make sure that they kept their minds focused on the election and concluded it as quickly as possible. So those are the three moments that came together to bring us the process that we now see unfolding.
So since then, what's the longest that it's ever taken to elect a new pope?
Well, there have been a couple of extremely long papal elections, of longer than 2 years, in fact. The one prior to Gregory X's own election is sometimes talked about as the first conclave, but that lasted over 2 years. And in the end, the citizens of the town of Viterbo in Italy, just outside Rome, where it was taking place, they got so fed up with the cardinals, they took the roof off the room where they were meeting, and they let them eat only bread and water until they came up with a result. And even then, it still took a couple of months. But there was another one, 1314, which lasted for 2 years. There have been periods in which conclaves have been much longer, and then periods in which they've been much shorter. There's been an oscillation in this, which has reflected the political and the religious circumstances of the papacy in different eras. And certainly in the modern era, since 1846, all conclaves have lasted somewhere between 2 and 5 days. So that will be our expectation for this time as well.
And on that, why do you think the most recent ones in the last basically 150 so years have been shorter?
Well, I think the cardinals are now very aware that the eyes of the world are on them. Perhaps the Holy Spirit is aware of this too, that the Catholic faithful are all looking at this process in a way that perhaps they didn't in the 17th or 18th centuries, when communications weren't so good. You couldn't, if you lived in lots of parts of the world, you wouldn't even find out who the Pope was until several months after an election was concluded. Whereas now, we're all watching, we're all waiting, and I think the cardinals feel that responsibility. And that helps. But there is also this longer period of discussion before the conclave. We've just had the Novendiales, the 9 days of mourning, and cardinals can get to Rome much quicker. That also almost certainly helps, because they can have a range of discussions, formal and informal, before it starts. So they ought to have a reasonably good idea already of who are the likely candidates who could command the levels of support that are required. And that's a big difference to times past.
And in this conclave, there's a lot of cardinals who are going to be voting for the first time. Some countries are represented for the first time. So can you tell us about some of those first-timers?
Yeah, well, this conclave is a bit of a mix, because it's not the conclave with the highest number of first-timers. That was probably John Paul, the conclave after the death of John Paul II in 2005, when I think all but 2 of the cardinals had been created by John Paul. So it was a very new experience for nearly all of them. This time, Francis has appointed only about 80% of the cardinals. And there are also, on that line, there are also more surviving kind of emeritus cardinals who have participated in either the 2005 or 2013 conclaves, but are now older. And they're still in Rome. They will have been taking part in the discussions over the last couple of weeks. and lending their wisdom and insights into the voting cardinals about how to go about this process, how to find consensus, how to let the Holy Spirit do his work. But yes, the cardinals this time, even compared to 2005, they probably know each other much less well, partly because they do come from more diverse parts of the global church. It was a specific policy of Pope Francis that every Catholic community, no matter how small and marginal you might feel it is, it needs to be included in the Sacred College. And so he elevated cardinals from places like Algeria, Iran, Burma, Mongolia. Um, and those cardinals, they're probably less well known to many of their colleagues because they don't sort of run into each other in the way that, say, the archbishops of New York and Dublin and Sydney and Paris might have done. But I mentioned those because the archbishops of Dublin and Paris and Sydney are not cardinals and they're not taking part in this conclave. So it creates a unique dynamic, and we can't be quite sure how that will play out.
Yeah, and we know that the cardinals have to be under the age of 80 on the day the Pope dies to vote in the conclave. So my understanding is there's about 100 cardinals who can't vote. I know you mentioned there's a lot, like you said, Cardinal Emeritus. But is there any chance that a cardinal over the age of 80 could be elected Pope?
Well, there's nothing to stop it. I mean, the only caveat to this is to say the last time that someone who wasn't a cardinal, or to expand it to this category, wasn't present in the voting hall, was elected, was in 1378, when Pope Urban VI was elected. But that's not a happy precedent, because there was a lot of dissent from the cardinals then, and in fact, many of them left Rome, claiming to have been forced to perform the election under duress, and they went back to Avignon, where the papacy had previously resided, and created the Great Western Schism. So I don't think anybody's looking for that to be repeated. But there's no reason in principle why the cardinals wouldn't turn to someone who's 80 or slightly over. I mean, one of the big unknowns in a way about this election is because of the great and wonderful advances in medical science. Popes are living longer than before. Everybody is living longer than before. And so some of the calculations which I've certainly seen in kind of analysis of papabili in the conclave, it identifies figures, who are so young that they could be pope for 30, even 35 years. And it's not necessarily clear that the cardinals or the Holy Spirit will think that is the best thing. They tend to be reasonably cautious about these things. On the one hand, you want some stability, you want a pope who will preside over the church for a good length of time, but it may be that 30 years is too long, and that a certain kind of inflexibility sets into the way in which people think about the problems arising around them. Well, that's true of popes as well. So it may be that there's a sense that actually the right age is kind of as it was last time and the time before. Someone 76, 77, something like that, who might well have a 10-year, perhaps even 15-year pontificate, but that will be enough.
And then tell us what happens when the new pope is elected. Do they just automatically have to say yes, or do they have a choice?
Well, they have a choice. I mean, the Pope isn't elected until he says in Latin or Italian, "Accetto," I accept the responsibility. And in practice, in modern times, I think everybody who has been elected has accepted. Possibly not the first time they were asked, but that is the moment, and then they're asked what name they would like to take as pontiff. There's a time-honored procedure for this, and I expect we'll see it playing out in much the same way, although we won't see that. We know nothing until the senior cardinal comes out onto the balcony of St. Peter's and says the famous words, the Habemus Papam, and then we all struggle to listen carefully to hear the Latin to see what the actual name is. Well, that was my recollection from last time.
Yeah, and it'll be really exciting, and I know you're going to be there, and Catholic TV is going to be there as well, so we'll all be waiting so eagerly. Miles, I just want to mention your book, Electing the Pope in Early Modern Italy. It's published by Oxford University Press. It gives a deep dive on the history of the conclave, and we hear that the paperback edition is going to be available in the U.S. probably in July. So where can people get a copy of that?
They can get it from all good bookstores.
Awesome. Well, Miles, it has been great to chat with you, and we are going to head back to more Conclave coverage on Catholic TV.